Hi, I'm Steven, and today I'll talk about Git for type design. This presentation is made for Typographics 2025 TypeLab, which is kind of a hackathon side conference for nerds, basically. And this presentation is a way to share some basics about Git that I find extremely useful, but I'll get into it. So, first of all, this lecture is sponsored by Aerotype, which is me. I make fonts, and you can buy them. Uh, I've made name sans, which is like a geometric grotesque, name mono, which is a monospace version of it, at curios, which is a black letter with lombardic caps, or black letter caps with stylistic set 2, maybe. Lang, which is a semi-slab serif. Lang Gothic, which is kind of a sans serif version of Lang. And then this new one, which is coming soon. I like to use the fonts I'm making in things like presentations because it is like a really good way to figure out what they do well and what needs improvement. This is still in a little bit of both of those categories. So enjoy getting a sneak peek, and improvements are on the way. Yeah. Past clients of mine include these and quite a few more. I'm really grateful and feel very lucky that I've gotten to work for these folks. Uh, I'm partly saying this just to brag, but also partly saying this because uh, several of these have required GitHub. Not all of them did. Sorry, Git. I'll get into the difference there and this, yeah, the interrelation there. But I have used Git on every project I've done for those clients. I also work part time at the Type Founders. I've gotten to work on fonts from several of my heroes through the Type Founders, where I'm a font engineer. I've helped on these fonts and many more. But yeah, if you don't already know these designers, definitely look them up because they make incredible type. I've used Git, as I said, for basically every font project in the last 10 or so years. I'm still learning. Git can get pretty advanced, but also you can do about easily 98% of it once you know a few basic things. So this talk is really going to focus on introducing you to a few basic things and kind of giving my views around how it's useful for type design. If, as is likely, you're new to Git and you see this talk and you're still confused, this is a pretty great book to read. It gets like very deep into things. And as I said, you can do most stuff with a little bit of knowledge. So you might not need to read this whole book, but it's really helpful maybe to get a wide survey of a lot of technical information. And then this still is very approachable. So yeah, highly recommend it. The other big thing is that once you know some Git basics, you can use Stack Overflow, which is so helpful to look up how to do things. And some of them, like this page, I end up visiting on Google every few months because I don't remember the exact steps in Git for a thing that I have to do, but I can easily remember how to find that information again. So let's talk Git. Have any of you seen this screen before? You might recognize it. It's from Zelda Breath of the Wild. It's when you die. And a nice thing about dying in a video game is that you can continue and you start back without losing all of your progress. This video is 10 tips for beginners, and it shows that you can actually set your own checkpoints in Zelda so that if you die, you get to start over kind of right where you left off, which is pretty nice. As it explains, if you have to go back to the last auto checkpoint, that might be quite a long time ago. You know, it's only going to be like 5 minutes, but I love checkpoints, either automatic or even better if you can save them yourself so you don't lose too much progress. You know, if you're trying to make production ready fonts, there are going to be monsters in the way. There's going to be lots of stuff to figure out. If you're making large or ambitious families, that is exponentially more true. So it's really handy to have strategies for how you can save your work along the way so that you don't lose progress when you make a mistake or when something happens that you didn't expect. So yeah, why use Git for type design? The basic reason that I use it is that it's a backup system. When I get in a car, I buckle my seatbelt. I've thankfully never been in a serious car accident, but you know, it happens to people all the time. And if you're wearing a seatbelt, it's a pretty good backup. Um, in Git, checkpoints are called commits, and it's kind of a log of like major things you've done in the project, or even just significant things you've done in the project. And so, just the most basic thing here is that if you accidentally say delete all of the A's, you can reverse that change pretty easily. So yeah, let's look at this. I've recorded a quick video here. This is RoboFont. This is name sans, display bold, and boom, I just deleted all of the A glyphs, which would be pretty ruinous depending on the project. Let's say you saved this change and you only had one version of this font, and I don't know. It can be hard to get back sometimes if you don't have any sort of backup in place. But here's VS Code showing the Git view of things. It's a very clear way to see, oh, all of these files were deleted, all of these glyphs were deleted. You can either revert those changes, or you can even say commit them into the history of the project. And here I've committed it. What we can do though is use the terminal, for instance, to kind of access the time machine layer of Git. I say that time machine is not a technical term or anything, but you can see the log of previous Git actions, and then you can reset back to one of them. There's various ways to kind of backtrack in Git, and one of maybe, I don't know, the UX complaints I have is that the core functionality is being able to go backwards in time on specific files, but that's also one of the slightly hard things to do. So yeah, you'll probably end up using Stack Overflow a few times as you're figuring out how to do these things. But yeah, here we have our glyphs saved from our terrible mistake, or intentional mistake in that case. Also, Git imposes structure, and it lends itself to helpful structures. So this isn't required for Git by any means, but this repository from DJR, Excellent Type Designer, is a really great kind of example structure of a project. And this is followed in many projects. Google Fonts projects, for instance, all follow a pretty similar formula, and I try to generally follow this as well. It doesn't have to be exact necessarily, but it's really just handy to have kind of an expected layout for each of your projects so that you know where you are, and probably somebody else might know where you are if you end up bringing a collaborator into the project. You might be thinking, wait a minute, why would you need Git for a folder structure and some backups? And the answer is you don't. You could, for an example, zip and timestamp your project every single day or every half day and back it up to Dropbox or some other cloud storage. Bottom line is you should definitely use some kind of versioning system, even if it's just this. And you should probably use that DJR folder structure or something like it, even if you're not using Git, because both those things are so helpful. Yeah, it's like super critical to have a few good practices. But I like Git for this. And Git works in a certain way that also enables collaboration in a way that kind of zipping your sources and putting them into cloud storage doesn't facilitate quite as well. So let's clear up some terms here. Even I made this slip up earlier, I think, just presenting this. Git is not GitHub. That's pretty confusing, right? They sound like they're the same thing. Git itself is software. It's technically known as a version control system. There are other version control systems that are less popular. GitHub is a website, or more accurately, like a service, in the same way that Instagram is a service. But I'll talk more about that in a moment. How to use Git well. This is kind of like what the log of commits looks like if you view them in a terminal, which is a primary tool for using Git. I'll get to this and other tools later on, but it's really helpful to know what a commit is. So a commit is like a significant change. It's kind of like a state, a moment in your project. And let's say you change the G of your font, and maybe you simplify that ear, and then maybe you simplify it again to be a single story G. Each time you make a commit, you have to give it a commit message. So maybe the first thing here is like you've just drawn the A and the G. So maybe you'll note that progress. And then you simplified the ear of the G, and then you made the G single story. These are just like quick messages so that you'll see it later on and you can go back to that point, or like know that you edited certain things at that point. Each commit is only the change that you're recording. So this is kind of weird to think, and more important maybe in projects that aren't just fonts. The thing about a font that's nice is that even if you've got a really complex project, you could zip the whole thing and it's probably a lot less data than a single video file or a single photo file, and certainly a single Photoshop file. So just saving timestamped backups in a Dropbox folder works. But this is a really cool thing because like you have the project, and then each additional change is just recorded as the literal lines of code that you've changed. So this is kind of an analogy, but let's say, you have the quantity 3 and then you add 1 to it. That could be a commit, you add up, and then the whole thing is kind of like the latest state at any given time. So this may sound really abstract. Bottom line is it's like a cool way to consider how you could save versions of a project. By the way, if you go back in your Git history, it just kind of like one by one rolls back these commits so it can kind of like step back to the point in time that you want to go to. And this is how Git enables both experimentation and collaboration. So here's a slightly more involved diagram of kind of the same thing we just looked at. A commit is actually just the change of this one file. So like this is kind of assuming, say, a glyphs package or UFO approach to saving a font source. But yeah, if you've only changed the G, that's the only thing that commit holds. And on the right, by the way, is like the overall state of the project. So that might be called the main branch of the project. You can make a new branch of a project to do something that might be a bigger change. So like making the G single story. And something useful to realize is that the main branch still has the kind of the main version of the thing. So it hasn't actually changed yet if you're working in a different branch. So not only is Git kind of like a time machine, it's kind of like a machine for making a parallel universe almost, or just like a parallel state of your project. And the great thing about that is that once you're confident in those changes, you can merge them back into the main, and there you go. You've got the project. If we alter this a little bit, it shows how useful Git is for working in a team of people. So you might be working on like the lowercase of the font, and maybe your partner is working on the uppercase of the font, or your collaborator or whatever. So maybe whoever's in the main branch or in their own branch decides to make the uppercase sans serif, and then you've gone and made the lowercase g single story. The state of the project in main is only the change that happened in that main branch. So the A is sans serif now. But you can do a merge, which merges your change into the main branch. And so now you've got the sans serif A with the single story G. If you're not familiar with changing glyphs in type design, that might have just confused you further. You can also find plenty of examples online of like how you would see this happen in a text file or like an HTML file for a website. In type design, the reality is a little bit messier often, but we'll come back to that. So the bottom line, and I know I've used that term a few times, but a commit is a significant change. And there's a couple of kind of pointers I can give for a commit message, the message you write when you make the commit. Um, and this kind of ties into how often you should commit. So you don't need to commit literally every time you change anything about your project. For instance, you might save your file quite a few times as you're working, but you don't need to commit literally every time you save your file. But it's also really not great to just like commit once a day, because then if you're looking back, you can't see what you were actually doing at that time. And if you're collaborating with somebody, they have no clue like the path you took to get somewhere. So it's also not that useful to commit too infrequently. The way I commit, it varies a lot based on the context, but maybe I'm making a visual change to the lowercase or some set of glyphs. I'll basically make a note of that. Like I fixed the ink traps in A to Z in the bold italic style. Git is recording the files that you have changed, so it might be not always necessary to say like what you changed in the commit message, but at the same time, it can be handy sometimes. You could also maybe say a smaller change, like I tweaked the tail of GNF. Maybe you did that in all of the sources or masters of a whole project. A lot of the time, I'm just making a commit to like before or after I've run a script that's made significant changes, sort of that Zelda example I gave earlier. Or if I'm like gonna go have a coffee or go to lunch or whatever, I'll make a commit. This was said by Andy Mangold, who's like a graphic designer and code guy. It was just like a throwaway tweet, I think, but I've remembered it for like 8 years or something. ABC, always be committing. And I would add pushing to that. Yeah, if there's any chance you're going to walk away and your computer is going to stop working or you're going to stop working, not to get morbid, it's really helpful if you committed and you pushed your work so that it can resume later. A push is uploading changes to usually to GitHub. A pull is downloading changes, usually from GitHub. And services like GitHub or other websites that are competitors, they host what we call remote repos. So, for example, this is the publicly visible repo for Recursive, a font project that's open source of mine, made for Google Fonts. And by the way, if you go to a GitHub repo, you'll see these like gray text labels. Those are the commit messages. They aren't always a description of the file that they're next to. It's really a description of the last thing that changed about that file. Sometimes a commit might have been a little messy, so maybe that file was incidentally kind of changed, but it wasn't the main thing that happened for that commit. But it's just worth knowing, like, I think that's a maybe slightly confusing thing early on. Okay, so for an example of a slightly more involved process and why Git is useful through GitHub. If this is you and you have a project going, you call the project the local repo or the repository that you're working on the local. And you would also likely have a remote, possibly on GitHub or a similar service. You would call that the remote repo. You might have a teammate. And maybe you have another teammate, and maybe you're all working on this project. If you have the local repo, all of these other repos are remotes, and you could technically sync between any of them directly, like through email or something, I think. But almost all the time, all three of you would just be syncing to and from GitHub, and that's the way you coordinate all of these different repos. You might call that GitHub version the origin. So if you hear the terms like local, remote, or origin, this is kind of how they relate. And it's called the origin because, it's the origin of all the repos. It's kind of like the source of truth, you might hear. Here's another open source font project, Chantel Sans. GitHub is really great. You can have your files there, but you can also have a README, and this just kind of gives an overview that's like visible below the files for whatever you're currently in. So if you navigate to other folders of a project in GitHub, those can also have READMEs. GitHub can have releases. So these describe the latest kind of like time, and you can attach downloads here, which is super handy in an open source font context. So I've mentioned that there are competitors to GitHub. It's a website, it's a service. So other people, other businesses do the same thing. GitLab is a big one. Here's an example of a public repo on GitLab. Inkscape is, it seems like a Adobe Illustrator competitor, perhaps. Bitbucket is another competitor. I think this one might be mostly for like enterprise usage. It's not as much of like a public-facing repo system. You can technically make repos public. I don't know. I'm not very familiar with it, but GitHub is not alone. Services like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket are a bit like a social network. So they're not just a cloud storage for your code. They're a way for people to collaborate. So this is Font Tools. It's some of the most important kind of like back-end code that goes into making font projects work. And it's got a lot of contributors over the last 15 years or so. You can see a lot of names you might recognize here, but all of these programmers have made big and little contributions that all kind of stack up to make Font Tools very useful. Services like GitHub also have extra features that aren't strictly part of Git. So issues is a concept pretty much, I don't know, I think it's well, I don't know. It's part of GitHub, and it's sort of like a forum or a message board where either the maintainer can post about a bug they've found out, or a user can post a bug or a feature request they might have. So if your open source font doesn't support Chinese, somebody might come along and mention that to you. So yeah, it should be pretty simple to add that. Font Bakery is another really useful open source tool. It also has issues, and this particular set of issues is very helpful. Font Bakery allows you to QA fonts, make sure that they're ready for other people to use, essentially. It's a very useful tool. And this is a place where like the many kind of quality checks in Font Bakery get discussed and improved over time. I personally sometimes use issues in even just private repos to kind of note things to do on a project. And it's nice to just have a place to like throw a to-do list, because you're going to find out things you have to fix along the way. Maybe you're using your font in a presentation, or maybe you hear from a friend like, oh, that one thing didn't work. You can just add it to the issue, or add a new issue. There's different levels of granularity here. It can also be more useful probably to do this kind of a to-do list in a pull request for yourself, but I'll get to that in a sec here. But yeah, I use issues and pull requests for to-do planning all the time. And if it's a particularly involved issue, I might kind of give it its own issue so I can write notes along the way. Helpful UI for pull requests is also part of GitHub. So a pull request is essentially telling whoever's controlling the main branch, like, hey, I made some good changes. I think they're good changes. Can you please pull it into the main branch? So these are also called PRs. And so in the case of Font Tools, for instance, there's a lot of PRs that are meant to clean up little bits of the library. So here, Jens Kudelek, I'm not super familiar with the ins and outs of this pull request, but it's cool it's publicly visible. He changed a few bits of the library to maybe be more consistent or easily recognizable. And you can see exactly which files changed, exactly how. And this is a nice example of how clean it looks when you're just working on code with Git and GitHub. So a confession. This is my workspace. As you can see, I have gorgeous mountains outside, and I'm very, very tidy and organized. Wait, no. This is my desk, actually. It's less beautiful, but I love it, and I'm really lucky to have a big monitor to work with, and fun things and helpful things on my desk to help me do my work, or deal with distractions or distract myself or whatever. This is all to say that I think that creativity can't always be perfectly slotted into Git. Git is made for engineering processes, a little more than exploration processes. It's more accurate to say that any font project is going to be a combination of these. You probably have more exploration early on and more engineering later on, but it's a continuum, and both these things exist the whole time. Exploration, I'm saying, is kind of like the visual side of things. So you're changing shapes. It's ambiguous. You don't really know what exactly you're trying to do. You're trying to figure it out. It's also somewhat linear, as in my experience. Git is sometimes set up so that it's really easy to make a branch and make a very specific change, like changing the name of base glyph, that we saw in that PR to glyph pen, or whatever that change was. It can be very specific and targeted, and limited in kind of a mature code project. In fonts, almost any time I've ever made a branch to make a visual change to a font, I've seen 5 other changes that, I realized I should clean up the spacing here or clean up this curve here. So it's not perfect analogy, but it's still useful to use Git. The other thing with exploration is that sometimes duplicating glyphs or duplicating files, even though that's not a very Git thing to do, it's pretty essential some of the time to just duplicate your whole source and make a change, and then you can see right in front of you the before and after. That's okay. Engineering side of things is more code based, which kind of naturally fits into the Git model. The stuff you make is more clearly right or wrong than it is when you're drawing something. Code is still very opinionated and expressive, and there's many ways to solve any problem, but it can still either work or not. So that kind of helps. Code is easy to branch and merge, and duplication is a big problem often because you might not know what the latest file is, and files are often interrelated. So yeah, you want to avoid duplication as much as possible often in engineering. So for an early stage font project, the yellow font here, it's got kind of a latest source, but I also archive sources as I go, and I decide to split it off sometimes. If I'm going to try something like changing the width range, making the condensed a lot more condensed and the wide a lot more wide, or making some aspect of it softer. I don't really have a perfect approach to this. And I guess the thing I'm trying to say is that Git is super helpful, but you still want to think. And this probably isn't the right approach for you exactly. It's just how I've been working. So tools for working with Git. I'll quickly explain these. This talk isn't going to deep dive into how to use these different tools, because ultimately it is most important to understand the core principles, and then any of the tools can do the thing that you need to do. So let's make an example change. This is the font source of this blocky font I've been using here. I have been making the thin masters more rounded at the edges and corners. So I decided I still hadn't done the period. Excuse me. I still hadn't done the period and exclamation point yet, so I went and rounded those. So this change in the terminal, here's what Git tends to look like. So terminal, you can print your working directory, and you can list the files that are in there. You can change directory to go into the font project. So you can say git status to see which files changed. And there we can see I've changed. On the right side, you can see ellipsis, exclam, period. You can add those. You can commit and add a message. I know I'm flying through this, but I'll kind of go through this in a couple of other tools. So you get a broad overview of how things look. Cool. And so that puts the commit message, and then we've just pushed it to put it up on GitHub. And now we have no changes. It's up to date with the origin main branch. All right, so that's the terminal. You have to remember a few commands, which is the main, downside. It requires a little bit of memory. It's not that much to remember. And if you forget how to do something, the answer is online. So it can be really good to work with some of the time. GitHub Desktop is made by GitHub, the company. You see your changes on the left side in a sidebar, and you can type out your commit message. You can see the code involved in your changes right there in a very clear way. You can commit. Pushing took me a second to find here, but it's up top. You push to the origin, and there it is. If there are changes at the origin, you can kind of fetch those and pull them into your local project. And you can see the history of your project right there. VS Code is actually my preferred way of interacting with code and Git. It is really great because it's got some of that same visual assistance that GitHub Desktop does. You can see the list of changes. You can see what changed where. This is just a bunch of coordinate points that have changed. So you can't really tell what that is visually, but you can kind of get a sense like, oh, there's some points moved around in some files, right? So you can type up your commit message and you can commit it, and then you can sync, which means pushing the changes up to the origin repo. The nice thing about VS Code is that when you open a project folder in it or a repo, you can also have a very easy built-in terminal that goes right to that project. And so you can do the more advanced Git stuff very easily when you want to. So there, for instance, we just kind of like reset. We went a step back to before we committed those things. This is nice because a lot of the time when I'm working on font projects, I've also got a lot of scripts that I use. So I might have a build script. I mentioned Font Bakery. That works in the terminal primarily. And so, yeah, Git is great when it's like one sidebar of VS Code, because VS Code kind of like is a very clear view of all aspects of the font project that aren't actually like drawing and spacing. You might use Glyphs app or FontLab or RoboFont for that stuff. And chances are, though, it's useful to have build scripts and records of your project. So VS Code is really handy. So I said a lot, but not that much. And if you're new to Git, you're probably pretty confused still. So here are some really handy resources. Some of them I mentioned, some of them I didn't mention. Git for Humans, handy book. DJR has the sample font repo. If you Google that, you'll find it. RoboFont Docs has a good article using Git that describes some of the specifics to RoboFont. Oh Shit Git is a really handy website with a couple of really helpful little pointers on like how you can go back in time and different ways you can work with Git that like describe the moments when it's not going perfectly well. Any presentation tends to focus on how things are when they're perfectly going well. And that's not always the case. Stack Overflow, Google those questions that you have and somebody's answered them. It's also more useful than, say, ChatGPT might be, because you can see discussion around answers and you can see more context. So that can be really nice, both as a way to understand your current question, but also to learn more over time. And then YouTube. My channel is just AeroType on YouTube. I'll list these links in the description. I'll post this video as a video. And if you've got comments or questions, pop them in the comments. I'll do my best to try to respond. There's so much possible complexity in Git that I won't be able to answer every question that comes up, but I love the comments anyway, even if you're just saying hi or whatever. So thanks a lot for watching. I hope that however you're working on your projects, you're using some kind of version control, and I hope your creative work is going great. Take care.